turning back to our top story tonight, the downing of Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 outside Tehran. There are still so many more questions than answers. Questions around the cause, the investigation, and what happens next. As families grieve, the search for those answers continues, not just from investigators or officials, but also from many of you. So many viewers have sent in thoughtful questions, and we're going to try to answer as many as we can with our panel here tonight. Janice Stein of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy is in our Toronto studio. Saeed Khan, a Middle East expert, is with Wayne State University. He's in Detroit tonight. And from Ottawa, Larry Vance, a former investigator with the Transportation Safety Board. Glad to have all three of you with us. Our first viewer question comes from Khalil Jafari, and he asks, and a lot of people actually asked a similar question, how could Iran allow civil aviation while they're attacking other countries? Larry, let's start with you on that.
Well, they're supposed to shut the airspace down if there's a perceived threat from military operations. That's how it's supposed to work. There's no central agency, though, in the world that says we're going to keep an eye on all of this and tell everybody, all the airlines flying all around the world, to in fact, don't go there. So it was up to Iran has control of the airspace. Iran should have shut their airspace down. There are protocols through ICAO that airlines and countries are supposed to use, but the international community is full of protocols and they're not mandatory. Something went wrong here. The Ukrainians should have been informed that the airspace was dangerous, and Iran should have shut it down. That's how it should have worked.
Janice, knowing what you do about this part of the world, were you surprised that there were commercial jetliners flying that morning?
I actually was, Ian, because the airspace previously had been closed over the Gulf. So it was surprising to me that the airspace around the major civilian airport would be open. However, what we do know is governments are always enormously reluctant to shut down their civilian airport. It's a signal of vulnerability to everybody else, and they go to great lengths to keep that civilian airspace open. Well, this was a tragic mistake here.
And as Larry points out, I mean, the airlines also make their individual decisions, talking to people like you, right, to assess the risk, and Ukrainian Airlines decided to go ahead. Let's go on to our next question now. Brian McEwen wrote us to ask, Iran said that they would target the United States and their allies, so he's wondering why there has not been more discussion about whether this was intentional. After all, Canada is a U.S. ally. Saeed?
Well, Canada is a U.S. ally, but the aircraft was actually Ukrainian, not an adversary to Iran, and not one that would be considered to be a U.S. ally as far as the coalition forces in the region goes. The second thing, of course, is the reason why the intentional possibility doesn't really factor in is because there really hasn't been anything conclusive to prove that Iran was trying to down this plane. In fact, just a few hours ago, the Ukrainian foreign minister simply said that it's too soon to draw any conclusions about this and is seeking to have full disclosure of the investigation before coming to some kind of a judgment on it.
Yeah, so I guess one question is, we may get to this, is whether it's a missile at all. But even if it is a missile, we heard from the United States, from the Prime Minister of Canada, from others, that it was likely unintentional. Let's go on to our next question. Michael Varus wrote us to ask, what actions will Canada take if the theory of the missile downing the aircraft proved to be true? Janice?
Well, I think the really crucial distinction here, Ian, was it deliberate or was it intentional? Or was it accidental? There's absolutely no action that our government will take if this was a tragic mistake. And I think that's the overwhelmingly likely event. For this to be an intentional attack, it would be unprecedented for a country to shoot down a civilian aircraft in its own airport. There is no precedent for that. So I think this is accidental. And if this is an accidental mistake, our government will not take any action, nor will any other government take action.
But Janice, help us understand, how could it be accidental? How would that come about?
It could have been accidental because an operator who was manning the batteries around the airport misread that aircraft, thought it was a military aircraft rather than a civilian aircraft, fired a missile to take down what they thought was a threat. The United States did that. It shot down an Iranian civilian aircraft when one of its operators made exactly the same kind of misjudgment. Humans make errors all the time.
And Larry, based on what you know about investigating air crashes, does the missile theory seem to be a plausible, likely one to you?
Absolutely, it does. Ian, what happened to the airplane what did we see in the video, provided that's validated? We see a missile hitting an airplane. We know that the airplane was disabled almost instantaneously. There's very, very few, probably no, mechanical issues on the airplane that I can think of, or that anybody that I talk to can think of, that would disable an airplane that quickly and cause the airplane to take the flight profile that it did.
Let's go back to viewer questions now. Jennifer and Mark Halleck would like to know, why were there so many Canadians on the flight, so many people connected to Canada? Saeed?
Well, Ukrainian International Airlines is actually one of the few, if any others exist, airlines that has a very simple flight plan to Canada. From Tehran, there's one stop at the hub in Kyiv, and then from there it's a nonstop flight to Toronto. So for those who are looking at perhaps the shortest distance, the shortest connection time from one point to the other, this would definitely be the ideal flight for them.
And we also had a lot of international students, Ian, students from Iran studying in Canada, many of them dual citizens, who'd gone home to Iran for the holiday break between semesters. That's why we had such extraordinary losses in the universities across the country.
Next question comes from Peter Rowley in Toronto. He'd like to know if there's any precedent for a country like Iran to be successfully sued for damages if, in fact, this was a missile that brought down the plane. Larry, we touched on this a bit already, but what's your view of that?
Yeah, there's not a lot of guidance in that area. There are a couple of occurrences from the past. One has already been mentioned. The United States shot down an Iranian aircraft back in the late 1980s. And what happened after that was that Iran sued the United States, and the United States ended up paying tens of millions of dollars to the passengers who were aboard that aircraft. The other one is the Malaysian Air Flight 17 that was shot down over the Ukraine, in fact, 4 or 5 years ago. And what happened there was that the passengers were compensated by the airline, by Malaysian Air, and I don't know the amounts, but I know that they were compensated for that.
You know, this whole story began really as an aviation story, and now it's turning maybe into a political relations, international relations story, and that leads us to a question from Cesar Cano, who says, can or should the Canadian government adopt a tougher position against Iran? And he also asks about options around, for example, implementing more sanctions. Saeed?
Well, if this was an accident, then it seems unwise and perhaps inappropriate to go ahead and seek some kind of tougher and even punitive measures. As terrible as this is, an accident it may be. If, on the other hand, it is proven to be an intentional act, and again, we simply don't know, there's no indication that it would be seen as an intentional act, well, then the Canadian government has to really decide whether it is sufficient to then press for perhaps more diplomatic isolation of Iran, press for more sanctions. But again, as both Larry and Janice have indicated, the current circumstances probably don't call for the Canadian government to really have too many options in that direction.
I really appreciate hearing all of you address these questions and providing the best answers we can at this point. And for those of you at home watching this, please sending in questions. This story certainly will merit more investigation. I have to tell you that some of the questions we got we're digging into because they don't lend themselves to easy answers as we continue to wonder what exactly led to this tragedy.